This video was made together with Hoc Est Bellum. Check out their channel and give them the credit that they deserve. The First Battle of Philippi was over without a clear winner. The liberators, though, were dealt an unfortunate critical blow with the death of Cassius. Brutus ensured his army wouldn't learn of his partner's demise, secretly sending his body to be interred on the island of Thasos. Brutus's army had the luxury of not being in an immediate need of engaging the enemy, due to his superior logistical situation. Brutus also occupied a defensively ideal position and could attempt to starve the triumvirs into submission. Unbeknownst to the liberators, on the same day as the first battle, an expeditionary force of triumvir reinforcements crossing the Adriatic had been intercepted and destroyed by the Republican troops patrolling the area. This video is brought to you by Vikings: War of Clans, an exciting MMO strategy game with PvP and PvE battles. It is a world where you can create an invincible army, uncover the cunning traps of your enemies, and become the mightiest conqueror among millions of players. Erect a host of powerful buildings to grow your civilization. Construct barracks, manors, a shrine to Odin, or even a mead hall in order to host reinforcements from your clanmates. The stronger your town, the better you can battle for glory among the Vikings. Raise an army of loyal warriors. In an experience that will please even the most exacting fans of strategy war games, you'll have everything you need to train recruits, balance your forces, and spy on enemy troops in order to defeat them in both PvP and PvE battles. And there is a lot going on this month. The Paladins and Asgard competition. Numerous in-game events to mark the 7th anniversary of Vikings. The Battle for the Throne, where you can win up to 1 billion gold. Personal and clan blitz competitions every 2 days. Personal infernal competition with Reign the Wardener as of August the 1st. Every Tuesday and Wednesday, get a 20% increase to the speed of learning, construction, research, and training, which is very helpful to new players. Download Vikings: War of Clans by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking my link in the description and get all these amazing rewards for free. In the following days, Antony would continuously marshal his legions, arraying them in battle formation while taunting and provoking Brutus to no avail. Meanwhile, Octavian, who, according to a source, remained hidden in the marshes for 3 whole days after his defeat, still suffering from illness, was able to slink back to the camp. Despite arranging his men in front of his fortifications, the Republican general was determined to fight a defensive war, not daring to advance past the safety of his fortifications. Brutus was perfectly aware of the dire logistical situation that his foe was in. Just after the First Battle of Philippi, he had warned his soldiers that their enemies' eagerness for battle was due to being pressed by hunger and lack of provisions. "We will make it part of our plan that hunger shall engage them before we do, so that when it is necessary to fight, we shall find them weakened and exhausted. So let us not be carried away by our ardor before the proper time," Brutus exclaimed. This stalemate continued for several days, until Octavian occupied a hill near Cassius's camp, which was inexplicably abandoned previously by Brutus. The position was difficult to occupy due to its nearness and exposure to the camp. Still, now that the area was evacuated, Octavian advanced with some troops and secured it. By using this elevated, entrenched position, the army of the triumvirs was now capable of extending its lines eastwards, thus directly threatening the Republican supply lines. Brutus immediately counteracted this movement by building and fortifying posts opposite the enemy entrenchments. But the clock was ticking against the triumvirs. With each passing day, the prospect of famine was becoming an imminent threat. It wasn't long before Antony was forced to dispatch a legion to Achaia to collect all the food they could find since Thessaly could no longer sustain such an enormous stationary force. There was no hope of resupplying via the sea, since the enemy controlled the sea routes. With winter fast approaching, Antony and Octavian would have to force an engagement or disperse their legions. Things were not rosy for the Republicans either. Despite having the topographic and logistical advantage, the Republican position was vulnerable to being rendered untenable. The eastward triumvir line extension directly threatened Brutus's exposed supply lines. His position would have been hopelessly isolated and exposed without a direct line of retreat if cut off. Discontent and dissension were gradually starting to spread among the rank and file of the Republicans. Groups of soldiers made their concerns more and more vocal as the days passed, nagging and complaining to their general for his passive stance, which they deemed a direct insult to their fighting prowess. Additionally, many of his officers kept irritating and urging him to take advantage of the army's eagerness. On the 23rd of October 42 BC, Brutus reluctantly led his army in the hope of being able to retreat within his fortifications in case the ensuing battle wouldn't go his way. He proceeded to form his legions in the typical for the time triple-line battle formation. Fearing being outflanked, Brutus overextended his line so that his left flank was rendered undermanned and weakened. The triumvirs soon followed suit, similarly arranging their vast army to their counterpart, with Antony commanding the left and Octavian the right wing. Antony and Octavian rode through their ranks, shaking hands with those nearest them, urging them to do their duty and reminding them that there was no way out. They would either conquer or perish. The orders of the Roman generals broke the eerie silence that preceded the battle, who commanded the two armies to march against each other. The two Roman armies had little space for fancy maneuvering in the confined space between the marshes to the south and the mountains to the north. Slowly and methodically, the legionaries on both sides covered the space separating them until the two eagles clashed ferociously. The onset was superb and terrible. Neither stones nor javelins were thrown, since such tactics were unnecessary within the confined battlefield. The danger of hitting your own was as great as hitting the enemy. The slaughter and the groans were terrible. The fallen bodies were carried back, and others stepped into their places from the reserves. Generals on both sides rode along the lines, barking orders and exhorting the men to fight on. Gradually, Brutus's right wing was able to push back their opposing Antonians, who were close to being overwhelmed since they were fighting an uphill battle. Around that time, Brutus's cavalry was able to push aside their counterpart and fell upon Antony's exposed left flank. Despite the immense pressure, the Antonians buckled, but did not break. Meanwhile, the situation was somewhat different on the other side of the battlefield. Octavian, displaying exceptional commanding abilities, inspired his men to push back the numerically inferior Republican left wing. As if they were turning a cumbersome machine, Octavian's men drove their enemy step by step, slowly at first, until the enemy's front line fell upon the second and third ranks in the rear. The ensuing chaos caused by the mingling of the ranks and the immense pressure of Octavian's men devolved into a rout. With perfect discipline, Octavian's men did not pursue the fleeing enemy. Still, they proceeded to attack and seize the gates of the enemy's camp, preventing their foe from gaining entrance and completing the envelopment of the remaining Republican legions, still engaged with the triumvir's hard-pressed left flank. It was the turning point of the battle. The Republican resistance had collapsed entirely. Brutus's legionaries were now transformed into a rowdy, panicky crowd, desperately seeking shelter and safety. Octavian's men were guarding the Republican camp, while Antony mercilessly hunted down everyone he could. The Second Battle of Philippi was over. Brutus was able to escape the initial onslaught and find shelter on a nearby mountain in the hope that he would be able to resume fighting the next day. But as soon as the sun came up the next day, the full extent of the disaster became apparent. There would be no more fighting and no hope of escape. Brutus commanded one of his bodyguards to kill him. The final death toll was huge for both sides. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but it is estimated that each army must have lost at least 20,000 men. Our ancient sources report some anecdotal incidents that would underline the difference in characters between the two triumvirs. While Antony is reported to have shown mercy and respect to Brutus, even sending his cremated remains to his mother, Octavian would display a more ruthless demeanor. For instance, to a man who begged for burial, he is said to have replied, "The birds will soon settle that question." When a father and son begged for their lives, he is said to have bidden them casts to decide who should be spared. But then, Octavian looked on while both died, since the father was executed because he offered to die for his son, and then the son committed suicide. In the aftermath of the battle, it was obvious who would be the master of the Roman world. The Republican cause was now in ruins, and a generation of young idealists had been decimated by years of ruthless conflict. There were still remnants of scattered resistance to the triumvir regime. Sextus Pompey would wage war in his island fortress of Sicily, which would remain secure for the time being, given his naval dominance. Sextus would become the last rallying point for the remnants of Republican resistance. But the writing was on the wall, and a new chapter in Roman history was now beginning. Ironically, after the successful conclusion of the Second Battle of Philippi, Octavian was in the most challenging period of his ascendancy to power. His contribution to the triumvir victory was lackluster compared to that of Antony's, especially when considering his blunder during the First Battle of Philippi. The triumvirs would soon realize that they had now much more to fear from each other than from the defeated remnants of their Republican enemies. If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.